Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all. I'm Luciana Spraker. I'm the Archives and History Officer for the City of Savannah, and I want to welcome you to our March Hungry for History, Jewish Involvement in the Revolutionary War. This is our first in a quarterly series this year in celebration of the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. Before I introduce our speaker, who I think most of you already know, I want to make a few announcements. The first, if you have a cell phone, please silence it. Second, we're marking another anniversary this year, and that's of our beautiful City Hall building, which is celebrating its 120th anniversary or birthday. So I want to let you know what our program is going to be next month, because we're also doing a special series for it. So next month our program is going to be on Wednesday, April 22nd at 3:30. I'll be your speaker, and it's going to be Breaking the Stained Glass Dome, Women in City Hall. So if that interests you, keep an eye open for that program announcement. I'm going to mention a couple of things that are on the tables so I don't forget. One, we have a special Georgia Historical Society publication about Georgia for the 250th anniversary. If you don't already have a copy, you can pick up a copy of that booklet. I've also put out a flyer that has two things. One on the front is about story groups. It's our new Mapping Savannah's History initiative. We're crowdsourcing what sites in history that you think are important and should be mapped on an interactive public map. On the back side is the dates of our upcoming community memory collection efforts and events throughout the year. So we want to also get you to participate with us on those events. So take a flyer, share it with somebody you know, and we look forward to collaborating with you. And I'm looking right at Deanie because she helped us out last year and continues to help us out on those community memory collection efforts. But let's turn our attention to today. So I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Rabbi Robert Haas. He's a native of McAllen, Texas. Rabbi Haas became the 14th spiritual leader of Congregation Mickve Israel here in Savannah in 2012. He received his BS from the University of Texas at Austin and began his first career as an elementary school teacher, which that's very interesting, yeah. Before matriculating at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem and Los Angeles, where he earned his master's degree in rabbinical ordination. After graduation, he served as an associate rabbi in Dallas and in Houston, Texas. He then spent a year volunteering in Africa with American Jewish World Service before moving to Savannah to serve in his current position at the third oldest Jewish congregation in the United States. Rabbi Haas is a sought-after comedian, and I can attest to that, and I think we'll get a little flavor today.
No.
He was doing it when I met him in the security office, so. A lecturer, a preacher, and an interfaith leader. Regularly he speaks and performs for organizations, radio shows, colleges, theaters, houses of worship, and institutions. He's married to April, and they have a daughter, Amira, and a son, Aryeh, thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Rabbi.
Thank you, appreciate it, guys. Hey, that's actually the long, I don't know how you got the long bio. Mine now is really short, so I apologize for that. That was about 6 minutes of the whole lecture, so I hope you enjoyed it. The next 20 minutes is going to be my bio from 25 years ago, so we invite you to. So thank you very much for coming here. It is such an honor and pleasure. I know some of you, and look forward to meeting some of the other ones, and some of you I don't look forward to meeting, but that's all. We're going to talk a little bit about, obviously, the Jewish involvement in the American Revolution. Some of the people here are members of the congregation where I serve, and they're actually more knowledgeable. I know Ann and Herbert, and a lot of these people know a lot more, so it's very ironic that I'm up here because we have people and Roger, who know quite a bit. But we'll go through a little bit of the American involvement. I'll answer questions at the end. And if you ever need anything, Congregation Mickve Israel is, of course, near Monterey Square. It was, as I've mentioned many times, ranked as the #1 congregation, Jewish congregation in the world by 3 out of 4 people who live in my house. Yeah, so very excited. So please come on by. We're the only synagogue in America that's a museum and a full-time synagogue. So it's pretty cool. So we'll talk a little bit about Jewish involvement in the American Revolution. So we're going to talk about the American Revolution. You know you have to go just a little bit before. And so we're going to start where it really starts in many ways for Jewish involvement. And the year would be, of course, 1290. So in 1290, we find an essential moment in Jewish history that has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about. It doesn't really affect other people, but in 1290, Jews are kicked out of England. So we're kicked out of England. We've been kicked out of France, kind of. We'll be kicked out of France about 100 years later completely. We're going to be kicked out of Spain in 1492. Columbus waves to us as he's leaving. We're kicked out of Portugal in 1496. We're kicked out of a lot of really wonderful places. So we really do a good job of getting kicked out. Now, obviously, we didn't do anything wrong, but you have to understand before we get to this, what was life like for somebody who was Jewish, especially the last 1,000 years in what we call Western Europe, or also Eastern Europe. So when you live in that culture, which was for most of it what we call kind of Catholic, and then Catholic and Protestant, everybody had their place in society. Everybody. Didn't matter what you were, you had your place. You're a doctor, you're part of the aristocracy, you're a peasant, you're a beggar, a farmer, you're part of a guild. Everybody's, but you are not an individual. Maybe if you're like the king or something, but everybody is part of something. You're part of your place in society. And there's a very good chance, 99% chance, that you're going to live and die in the same place in society that your parents did and that your children did. Once in a while, there could be a genius or somebody get lucky, but you're generally going to be where you are. And what we see is this is the case for everybody in Europe except for a few groups. What we call the Romana today, the Gypsies maybe a little bit, maybe some idol worshippers who are still pagans, who are still around, depending on what period, especially the early part of the last millennia. And there's Jewish people, and we are outsiders. We may live in a country, but we are not part of that country. Nobody's a citizen because you're part of your group, but we're always the other. We're the outsider. And sometimes there are good uses for the outsider. I mean, we all know the most famous was money lending. Christians couldn't charge interest. We need people to collect taxes. It's great to have. We need people to go trade and go to other places, and Jews knew languages. We could speak to each other. There were only a few positions that Jews were allowed to have. We couldn't be in guilds. We couldn't be shipbuilders. We were aristocracy. We couldn't be landowners or farmers. So it was a very strict world for us. Sometimes things were pretty good, and sometimes they weren't so good. But it was always dependent upon who was in charge or what the situation was. If the peasants are revolting, it was probably bad for us. If you had a strong king who kept strict control or strong leader, it was probably good. Because if you're in charge, you don't want any issues. You don't want people killing people unless you're telling them to kill people, right? You don't want just mass killings or uprising because eventually they come after you. And of course, the scapegoating was easy because there weren't that many groups you could scapegoat. You had Muslims there, but you don't want to scapegoat Muslims. What's the problem with scapegoating Muslims? What do Muslims have? They have big countries that have big armies. You know, it can be very problematic to create havoc but Jews didn't have countries. They're very easy to use as scapegoats. Sometimes we bring the Jews in because they're good and have skills. Once we learn the skills, then they're not as needed. In a lot of places, Jews were sent into two different areas, especially in the 18th century. The shtetl, which is a village like, anybody seen Fiddle on the Roof? Or a ghetto, which is kind of a walled area within a city. You know, you go and you work, and you have to go back in the walled city to sleep. There were always smattering of Jews in certain places, but it always depended on the country. The Dutch were very good. When the Dutch started becoming a thing, you know, especially in the in the 17th century, they welcomed a lot of the Jews, especially those kicked out from Portugal and Spain. But it was nice. They were much more supportive. But it wasn't like we're giving you equal rights, because nobody had rights. You're part of this, whatever group. So this is the world where a lot of Jews lived in. Now there's also the Muslim world. And there is a myth that Jews and Muslims have never gotten along. That is a complete, not only myth, it is entirely inaccurate. Jews did very well in the Muslim world. If you were Jewish in the 1700s, you want to live in the Muslim world. You Jews in the 1600, 1500, 1400, 1300, all the way back to the 8th, 7th century, only in the modernity has the Muslim world be a little more difficult. It was the most educated place in the world, and they made Jews second-class citizens, which in America has a terrible connotation. But in the Muslim world, second-class citizen is great, because you have certain privileges and uses, and you're usually, not always, but usually protected, in some cases even doing better than everybody else. So we come to this world where Jews are ostracized. By the 18th century, most Jews lived in a small area in Eastern Europe called the Pale Settlement. You had Jews in Western Europe, some in ghettos, some that were starting to live in society. And it's interesting to see how that's going to affect what we're going to see, because in 1654, the first Jewish ship arrives in New York. The Dutch had lost Brazil to the Portuguese. The Jews are kicked out. One ship ends up in it's actually New Amsterdam. And there have been Jews coming to America, but they're mostly like traders or adventurers, kind of like, me, guys who live on the edge of society and are really tough, like Joel and I and Carol. Well, actually true like Carol, but not. And so they get there, and the governor doesn't want him to stay. He's Dutch. The Dutch have been very good to the Jews, but he doesn't want him to stay. Jews call a couple friends, they're allowed to stay. But this is where irony starts to happen, because a few years later, the English take over New York, New Amsterdam. It becomes New York. What did we know about the English and the Jews? What did the English do? I just said it a second ago. It's not like last year. We were kicked out of England in 1290. So with England taking over New York, what would you think happened to the Jews? We should have been kicked out. However, things have changed, because Oliver Cromwell is now in charge, and he welcomes the Jews back into. He says, "Come on, we need some Jews here. Let's bring some Jewish people." And he welcomes them back into England. And they're treated better in New York by the English than they were by the Dutch. So the ironies never cease. And if you're wondering something really interesting, Shylock, by the way, written by, what's his name? Shakespeare. I can never remember that guy's name. He's this stereotypical Jew. Shakespeare never met a Jew, probably. Maybe when he was in Italy, but the Jews were allowed in England. So we now have something really unique. We have a country that is being much nicer to Jews than they ever have before, and much nicer than most places in the world. And that is, of course, the British. The British welcome Jews after Oliver Cromwell is killed and beheaded and his head's on a stake. They still are doing pretty well for the Jewish community compared to other places, which is amazing, because we haven't been there hundreds of years. Now we're there. And as time goes on, usually things start to get worse, but they're not. They're stabilizing for Jews. It's pretty good compared to everywhere else. And then we come to America. And what we see in America is people moving here from other places. Most of the Jews who came to America before 1750 were what we call Sephardic Jews, coming from originally Portugal and Spain. A lot of them migrated to places like England, and they come to America. The largest boat to come to America, of course, comes to Savannah. In 1733, we become part of this community. Oglethorpe gives us full rights, as we all know, because on the boat was a Jewish doctor, right? Here, the truth of stereotype. And so what we're going to see is a very strange moment in Jewish history. One of the strangest when it comes to the American Revolution. Because who are we revolting against? The British. And what have we seen starting in the 1650s? The British are going to be better to the Jews than almost anybody at that time period. They are welcoming us in this continent. On this continent, again, there's different places, but in all places, it's better here than in Europe. In all the British places, all these colonies, Jews are doing better than in Europe, and maybe even in some places in the Muslim world, and certainly in Eastern Europe, where most Jews live. We come here and the different colonies are generally giving Jews more rights than they've ever seen. Now, Georgia may be the best. We get full rights here, which is insane. The full rights we received in 1733 in Georgia may have been the first time we received full rights since a guy named David built a temple. That's how long it had been. If you don't know that story, please see your minister or your priest and read your Bible, right? So we're getting full rights in Georgia. And Georgia's one of the first 13 colonies to secede, right? And so what you're seeing is really a very strange situation. In this country and in our city, we have people who are doing very well. We're going to talk about some Mordechai Sheftel. Obviously, if you haven't heard of him, his parents came on the boat. One of the first two non-Native Americans born in Georgia. And he's going to become the highest ranking Jew in the military for the revolution who was Jewish. I mean, it's Jewish twice. We're going to see when Oglethorpe gave the Jewish people on the boat houses and gardens and farmland like everybody else, they gave muskets to the Jewish men and said, guess what you're going to do? You're going to protect us from who? From Spain and Florida. They're giving Jews weapons to protect the city. I cannot tell you how strange that is, because it's never happened. Never. Now, Jews had muskets because you had people who were on the frontier and protecting yourself, so it wasn't like Jews didn't have guns. But for the government to give you a musket and say all the Jews are protecting us, that's just not ever happened. I mean, that's the strangest thing ever. Now it doesn't seem so strange, but back then it was crazy. And not only that, when they gave us farmland and the house and the garden, once they changed the way, Savannah worked a little differently. Once they changed it, what were the restrictions on Jews in terms of what businesses they could go into? None. There were no legal restrictions. Now, there were some under the table restrictions. Can you enlarge your holdings? Can you buy land at will? The answer is yes. As long as you've got something called money, you can buy stuff. Jews were not allowed to own land in Europe in most cases, and certainly not farmland. So this is a very strange situation, because you have Jews now coming to places like Savannah, New York. The first congregation is in New York. The second is in Rhode Island, Truro, Savannah. Charleston, Jews have been living there, but they didn't start synagogue. Charleston is going to be the largest Jewish city in America for almost 100 years. We'll be the largest Jewish city in America for a few years, then Charleston for about 100 years. So you see the Jewish community and people are moving here in small numbers. We'll talk about the percentages, because this is still the Wild West. We think of America as the center of the world, and it is today, but back then, America was the Wild West, before there was the Wild West. And if you're Jewish, it is the wild, wild, wild west. Because being Jewish is all about being in a community. And you're usually isolated as a community. And even when you're living in places like Holland and Amsterdam, where they're a little bit more open, you still really are living in your Jewish community. You're doing business, you got some friends, but your real community generally is the Jewish community. And you come here, and guess where the Jewish community is? It's there. It's across an ocean, and getting across that ocean ain't easy. So not a lot of Jews came here because even though things could be difficult, that's what you knew, that's where your family was, that's where your community. If you're Jewish, you need 10 people to pray. If you're religious, you need to be together to have a Seder, to do funeral rites. So the Jews coming here were a little bit more adventurous, but it was really a strange place. One, because it was so much better in terms of rights, but also it was really far away, and most Jews looked at this as like, that's a crazy place. When did the first rabbis come to America? What decade? The 1840s. You didn't have Rabbi. You had one rabbi who visited America in like the 1790s, just on a trip. Yeah, everybody here, he went to Truro, and it's a synagogue in Rhode Island, gave a brilliant 2-hour sermon, standing ovation. The only problem was he spoke in a language that not one single person understood. Not one person. We don't even know what it was. It may have been Ladino, a Jewish language. We don't know what the language was. Nobody understood it, but apparently it was awesome. Most people don't understand me, but I still speak the language barely. So you come to this place, and the restrictions are, even in the colonies that were more restrictive, it wasn't as bad as other places. And Jews are here, and we're merchants. A lot of them were merchants, because that's where you can make money. That may have been one of the experiences they had, because that was something they were allowed to do. If you can't be a shipper, you can't, and so people like Mordechai Sheptel are enlarging their holdings and becoming a respected person in the community. Abigail Minus, probably the most important Jewish woman of the 18th century in the world, was a member of this community, moved here 1733, had kids before, had kids here, husband dies in the 1750s, and a very smart woman, instead of getting married and making her new husband rich, what did she do? She stayed single. She stayed single the rest of her life. She had daughters she encouraged to be spinsters. You know the word used. Why? Because you get to keep your money. It's kind of nice. And she becomes one of the wealthiest women in America, owns a tavern. We'll talk about her influence in the war. And so we're seeing this, that in synagogues around the country, and how many synagogues were they at the outbreak of the revolution? 5. I know some of you know this. So, as I said, New York, Rhode Island, Savannah, Philadelphia, Charleston, and then Richmond will be founded after the revolution, but before Washington is elected. So this is the world we're living in, a Jewish world where we're doing better than ever before. Opportunities we've never seen, although most of the Jews. Now, we get to the 1760s, and what percentage of the population is Jewish? Today, it's an incredibly high percentage of America, just under 2%, But back then, it was 0.1%. A very small percentage. This is one of the other reasons we were having so many rights, because the lower the number of the people who are different, the more welcoming. If you get too big of a number, as we saw with the massive Jewish immigration in the 1880s and 90s, where 3 million Jews came over, we saw a lot more anti-Semitism. Small number is not such a big deal, and they're doing great. And then all of a sudden, we see things start to change in a way that is really incredibly brilliant. They start seeing themselves as part of what? The community they're in. They look at this, even before we're a nation, I'm part of the Savannah community. I'm not part of the Savannah Jewish community. I'm part of the Savannah community because people started looking at themselves differently. We looked at ourselves as individuals. Because England is way over there, and we're here. And as long as we're sending them money, they're actually being pretty generous with what we can do with our time. And so all of a sudden, guess what? I've got friends who are not Jewish. Mordechai Sheftel, kids marry non-Jews, convert. People even convert to Judaism, which was not allowed in those places. Intermarriage. You have Jews who are marrying, intermarrying, who are not religious, or religious because there's no requirement. If you're Jewish, you don't have to be part of the synagogue. You don't have to go to services. There's no rules. You can now there's always going to be, you're not going to be allowed to be mayor, and you can't be on the city council, but you can be on this committee. You can be in the Masons, which is a huge deal. Jews being in the Masons, you think that's happened in Europe? Maybe in a few very special cases of people whose last name is Rothschild. But if your name ain't Rothschild, you ain't doing this. And we're now part of this community. And so when people start to get outraged about something like the Stamp Act, what happens? We start getting outraged too, because why? The Stamp Act is taking money, because so many Jews were merchants, and that's who it affected quite a bit. A lot of these laws affected merchants more than anybody else. And now we're going to be paying extra taxes we don't want to pay. However, when we were in Europe, we're paying way higher taxes. And the restrictions are much worse. And there's a good chance the government will one day just take everything we have without us even being able to say, don't do it. We could be kicked out of the country, or kicked out of the countryside, or the population may turn against us. And now we're getting upset about extra taxes, which sounds normal because we all get upset about extra taxes, right? Except for Herbert. Herbert loves paying taxes. He's like, we need higher taxes. But now we're getting upset because all the other people, because we're used to what? Having our own identity and being on our own. You know, we've got a lot of freedom here. I can't say the word freedom yet. We're still part of Britain, but we're looking at ourselves as part of the community, maybe even citizens of Britain, but the word is citizens. And so when we lead up to the Revolutionary War, we're going to see an incredible irony. The majority of Jews, and it was a very small percentage of the country, will become patriots. The vast majority. Now, still, some will be Tories, but a vast majority will be patriots because they're seeing what other people are doing. Now, this, of course, is strange because you're a patriot. You're going against the government. You're deciding to go against. Usually when we're persecuted, it's because we didn't do anything. Now we're actually actively working with these other people to go against the government, protest. How many Jews protested the government? And if they did, how long did they live? Not long. We're protesting the government. We're throwing tea overboard. We're joining the Sons of Liberty. We'll talk about some of the individuals. And this is against the country that has been better than us than almost anybody, certainly in Europe in recent years. So it's really quite astonishing that so many of the Jews who were here decided to support the Patriots. Now, of course, when it first started happening, there were a lot of people, even some like Moses Texas, who was probably one of the most, not Gershom Texas, but his brother Gershom, probably one of the most famous of all the Patriots who were Jewish. They were debating it for a second, but the fact that they eventually went in is really quite remarkable. And so we, by and large, support patriots, and we go to war eventually with England. Now, we've had training too, because why? We've had muskets for a long time now, you know? Muskets were very common, especially if you were not living in big cities. And so we decide we're going to support this revolution, knowing full well that as Jews, if we lose, we are not going to be in good shape. Because other people who are Protestants, you know, there'll be some punishments maybe, obviously, but there's lots of them. They can't go out and wholeheartedly punish everybody who was a patriot if they win, because that would be punishing the majority. That means business would, you can't put, 70% here. You can't put 70% of the population in jail because there's nobody who's making money for England, right? But for the Jewish population, this 0.1%, we have no trouble punishing them, as we see by the way they were treated when they were captured by the British. And so, by and large, the Jewish community supported the revolution. We'll look a little bit at a few of the people, and then we'll talk a little more. How much time do I have, by the way? It's
15.
Oh, really? So I didn't go very far. Okay. Here is Gershom Sextus. I always pronounce his name Sextus. If anybody hears of another way to pronounce his name, even if an authority like somebody famous tells you, just know that that person is wrong. I'm right. So, probably the most important man for the revolution, he was what we call like a lay minister. He was a lay rabbi. Very prominent in several places, and in New York, when they're marching in and coming, he gives a fiery sermon saying we need to rebel. Takes a lot of the stuff from the synagogue and he goes to Connecticut. And he lets the Tories, a few of the Tories are still in the congregation, and says, if you want to do it, you're in charge now. And he leaves and says, I'm going to be part of this rebellion. A lot of people had to leave town to go somewhere else if they knew the city was going to be taken. And he will serve as a leader at the synagogue in Philadelphia for many years. His brother was in the revolution. And you will see that the fact that he gave this fiery sermon as the British are coming, and then gets right out of town and says, if you want to do this, we're leaving. I mean, he wasn't wavering at the end there. This is the Truro Synagogue, which is the oldest synagogue building. You often see that it's the oldest synagogue. It's not the oldest synagogue. It's the oldest synagogue building. The oldest synagogue is in New York. This is the current Shearith Israel, the oldest synagogue in America. Again, the building is much newer, obviously, but this would be the oldest congregation in America, one of the 5. This is the coat of arms of Francis Salvador, a very prominent man who was only in America for a few years and would be an ardent supporter of the revolution and would become the first Jewish person killed in South Carolina in the war. And again, his name is well known. He became very wealthy very quickly. You could make a lot of money if you knew what you were doing and you came to America. We had all these opportunities and know-how. And he was one of those people who right away all right. Now we'll go back to Gershom Sextus. Not only was he a patriot who supported the revolution, he was probably the leader of the minority who thought we should not have to pray to Jesus as a Protestant, which directly eventually led to the Bill of Rights, number 1. Because it wasn't just Jews, because if it was just the Jews, it would be a small amount, but who else in America? Catholics. There are Protestant groups that do not want to do this as well. They don't believe they need to swear an oath, except for, and so he was one of the leaders who ensured that once we have a country and the Constitution, and then we have a Bill of Rights that says, what? Freedom of religion. The government cannot force you to be part of any religion, which is amazing because the revolution was not about religion at all. Religion, you had religious leaders like Samuel Adams, but it wasn't about freedom of religion because they were the same, they were Anglican, most of them, or Episcopal, depending on what you call it today. The revolution was about freedom of expression, about citizenship, about having our own country. But later, a lot of groups got together and said, we want this to be also a country that is free of religion in many ways. And there was a lot of arguments both ways. Most of the anti-Semitism that came with the beginning of the country itself was over this issue. Do I need to sit in a courtroom and put my hand on a Bible and swear allegiance as a Protestant to this country? And of course the Jews were a very small percentage, but he was one of the leaders, one of the, I don't remember how many, when President Washington was inaugurated for the first time, he was one of the clergy invited, the only Jewish clergy member. He's the one who was at Truro, who helped with the letter to George Washington congratulating him. George Washington went to Truro Synagogue, and that letter has become very famous. It's not the best letter from a president to a congregation, and it's not the first letter. The first letter is at a congregation, Mickve, Savannah. But of course, he was at Truro, so Washington went to visit Truro when he was promoting the Bill of Rights. And so that's why that letter, which is inferior to our letter by a lot, became much more famous. There's a lot of old boys club with Mickve, there's some stuff going on there. So now most of the Jews in America were Sephardic, but by the mid to late 1700s, you start seeing Ashkenazic Jews coming from Western Europe, even some from Eastern Europe. So you had a mix of Jews coming into America. But they all unified by and large, whether you're Portuguese or Spanish or Dutch or whatever. When you came here, you eventually became part of this unification process, which of course is unique in history at that time. And so let's go on and see a couple of those, because I hope I didn't get as far as I wanted. Chaim Solomon, we'll talk about a couple individuals now. There are three individuals who were very well known for the support of the revolution. He is by far the most. He is the man who gave more money to the revolution than anybody else. He is the man when Washington ran out of money and needed around $15 million-ish or whatever it was, 20,000 back then. He said, call Chaim Solomon. Not actually calling a phone because they didn't have him back then. And he's the one who raised the money, sold bonds, did whatever you did to raise money. I don't understand it. But he was the guy. He has become very famous. There are statues of him. His name is synonymous with banking and the founding of the country and the rescuing of George Washington, who would have lost because they didn't have food, they didn't have clothing, they didn't have arms, they didn't have transportation. He funded all of it. Died bankrupt in the 1780s. Gave all his money, and he became a pauper and died penniless because America couldn't afford to pay him back. And all those bonds, whatever he sold to France, France couldn't afford to pay back. France lost a lot of money. Led to, of course, their revolution. So he would become the most famous financier of the revolution, which of course brings the stereotype of Jews being financiers, but it just shows that how dedicated we were, because he gave everything, all his money. The same thing with Mordechai Sheftel, who I mentioned from Mickve, Israel and Savannah. He became enamored with this revolution. He became one of the poster boys for the Savannah Revolution. He was called the rebel-rousing Jew by the governor. He became a colonel. He was in charge of the supply lines for Georgia and South Carolina. He's the guy who chose the person to go sign the Declaration of Independence, which is actually not a big deal back then. Nobody wanted to do it. If he had known how big a deal it was going to be, he probably would have signed it himself. Then we'd have a Jew sign it. That'd be awesome. That would be amazing. I signed it. But recently when I broke in and signed, they weren't real happy about that. I spent some time in prison for that one. So he gave all his money as well. Mordechai Sheftel, Mordecai and his son were captured in Val Savannah, spent most of the time on prison ships, let go, captured again with Antigua. They treated him very poorly. We have some recent letters from a ministry who befriended him and some others. If you were Jewish, what they would do is they would force you to eat pork, and he was religious, Mordechai Sheftel. They dipped his, most famously, they dipped his utensils in pork fat. So he had to eat with his hands. And when he was able to finally free himself, he ended up in Philadelphia because he couldn't come back to Savannah. He ended up broke. Now he lived a little bit longer. Chaim Solomon may have been able to work his way back, but he died. And Mordechai Sheftel eventually moved back to Savannah, never became as wealthy as he had been before, but he becomes the president of Mickve, Israel, and does pretty well considering how poorly he was treated. Other Jews who were on these boats, if you're not eating pork, you're starving. You're eating whatever is left over from the other people who are captured. So several people who refused to eat pork actually died shortly after their time in prison because these prison ships were very, very anti-Semitic. A lot of it had to do with what we talked about. I mean, if you're British, you're thinking, wow, we did so much for the Jewish community. They are not showing appreciation. And you imagine the Jews in England, they're saying, wait a minute, what are you guys doing? We're doing not so bad here. Let's not rock this boat. Because I'm sure the anti-Semitism in England shot up when they heard about what some of the Jews were doing here. But again, it's still a very small percentage. And of course we have Abigail Minus, probably the most important Jewish woman, who gave an incredible amount to the revolution. Unlike Sheftel and Solomon, smart enough not to give all of her money. She gave a lot, more than I think any other woman, but she kept a lot too. She ran a tavern in town after the war. Now, because she was a woman, she was given some special permissions. When they took Savannah, even though they knew she was a patriot, they let her leave with her family, and they let her keep her holdings as well, even while she was gone. Whereas Mordechai Sheftel, the others, they took everything. If the British took it, they took it from him. Now, there were still Jews who were Tories who were living in it, and it's really hard because I haven't read as much, but I probably should. What was life like after the revolution? And you had Tories and patriots in the same synagogue after the war. A few of the Tories left and never came back, but a lot stayed. And what was life like in all the churches and houses of worship and in life? I'm doing business, and I know you were a Tory. And you lost. Why are you still here? You were fighting against me. And in some places, Mordechai Sheftel found this, you get there, and if the British have taken control of the city and they know you're a patriot, the Tories who are not even in the army may go around and kill you. It was very trying. Now we have the #1 synagogue in the world. Also, I don't remember its name, but played a part in it as well because Mickve, Israel was part of Savannah at this time already. We were in this building. We didn't even have a building at the time, but by and large, most of the people who were Jewish supported the revolution in our congregation as well. And what we see is the revolution for those who are Jewish was in some ways the same experience as those who weren't, but in some ways a very different experience because of our history. We were not Protestants. We were not part of this Protestant world. We were not part of the Catholic world either. We were outsiders, and all of a sudden we took a very big chance. Probably a bigger chance than our Protestant neighbors did. If you were Catholic and you fought and you lost, you still have countries that can support you. If you were Jewish, not so much. And we see that a lot of the Jewish community supporting was amazing. And after the war, and after we won, the fact that the Jewish community was still working with people like Madison and President Washington and a few others to try and ensure that there were freedoms for those who were minorities, especially because we served. Because we know in a lot of places, after a war, you served, they turn on you. Yeah, you did your duty, and they're going to turn on you. They could have easily said, nope, you may have fought with us, but we're going to have religious persecution and all these issues. Who ended up being the best supporters of the Jewish community in this regard? The most famous people in America. Who? George Washington, Madison, Thomas Jefferson, even Hamilton. They were all very supportive of this idea. And let me tell you, these guys did not get along with each other. But they had good relations with the Jewish community. In some cases, maybe more, there's always a rumor that on some of the bills, you would see stars representing 15 colonies. They were 6-sided stars. Some say that's because of Haas Solomon. George Washington said, well, you didn't get your money, what can we do for this guy after he died? And that is probably not true, but it's a great above and life, as we say. All right, so what time is it? I was supposed to talk 45 minutes? Okay, I did, okay. Sorry I didn't get to everything. But I'm going to take some questions, 15 minutes of questions. All right. Now, again, anything you read that is different than what you said, this is America. And we're all free to be wrong. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so remember that.
Okay, I'm wondering if the acceptance of Jews was partly based on slavery, because they had black people to look down on and to degrade, and so they didn't need the Jews as a scapegoat.
That is entirely possible when you have somebody else to look down at. Now, there were Jews who were slave owners. You know, where we have an exhibition coming out May 1st. It's going to be 7 months, Jews, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, freedom, religion in America. And we have to look at ourselves and say there were Jewish slave owners. It was part of society. It was, you were considered somebody, and it's a terrible thing to look at. Some of these people did, some of them didn't. But it is terrible. You may say to yourself, wait, right, there was some. Now again, the slaveholding business really started to dominate very soon after the Revolution. It was big before the Revolution, but it's after, because right around here, what did they create? Right over there. Cotton gin, right over there. Am I spacing the right way? Yeah, somewhere over there. Yeah. Once the cotton gin was invented, and Eli Whitney, by the way, made no money on it. It was too easy to copy. That made it even worse for the African Americans, because slavery became a major business. And the word now. I have no problem saying Jews were involved, because Jews were involved. I mean, and it was truly terrible. What I have problems with is, you go online, you see that Jews ran the slave trade, and all Jews owned slaves. Well, we were 1.1% of the population, and most of us were, a lot of us were living in places where they didn't have slaves. So, were there Jewish slave owners? Absolutely. Were most people who were slave owners or in the slave trade Jewish? Absolutely not. That is a really anti-Semitic trope, but it is really true that Jews did own slaves. Which, as we know in the Bible, it says very specifically, don't do it. We were in Egypt. So that is an issue that we have to deal with as a Jewish community, and say to ourselves, this is something terrible we did, and we should not forget that we can use excuses like everybody, like the best of them. Yes?
Histories of the Revolution, even ones specifically about the finances, don't mention Solomon or Abigail Mins, and was that anti-Semitism that dropped them out of the history?
And the time, remember, they were not as appreciated much in their time as they were later on, when people look back. But they were major, especially Haas Solomon. He didn't get all the recognition at the time because he was Jewish. It was a small population. But you're right. Was it anti-Semitism? Was it because he was part of the small group? Was it because we wanted to really hype up the Protestant? Could have been a little bit of everything.
Morris and the others.
Yes, Morris. Well, Chaim Salomon worked with Morris. He was the one who got money for Morris to do these things. Morris, was it Robert Morris, right?
Yes.
Robert Morris was, I just forgot his first name. I don't know how I forgot his first name because I know people's names wrong. But Robert Morris is probably one of the most famous others, but Chaim Salomon was his money guy. You know, Morris needed money, he went to Solomon.
What did Morris do?
Morris was probably one of the most famous financiers of the revolution as well. Now, how they make their money, I don't understand how people make money at all. I don't understand financing and bonds or anything like that. So don't ask me about your textbook.
I'm not sure that a lot of people understand why Jews became money lenders places.
I mentioned that earlier, but the stereotype of Jews as moneylenders is, in Europe, Jews were very limited in what jobs they were allowed. There were very few jobs Jews could have. One was a tax collector or a rent collector. One was a moneylender because for a not insignificant period of time, the Catholic Church didn't allow Catholics to charge interest. So you can't go into money lending if you can't charge interest. Jews are not part of the Catholic Church. They had a very specific and important role to play as money lenders because they could charge interest. Now,
When usury sin under the Catholic Church.
it was a sin of the Catholic Church, not for the whole period, because after a while they finally said, we can't let these guys, we got to do it, we got to make money. So they started changing that, but we have to remember usury or money lending was a dangerous field. It's not like today where you're sitting in a bank or you're on your computer. If you were Jewish, and you usually often had to look different, you dressed different, you had a hat, sometimes you had to wear some sort of not always a star, but something, an emblem saying you were Jewish. If you're traveling and people see you, what do they think? He's got money. They had to pay for armed guards at all times. They had to charge a very high interest rate, like 60%. Why? Because what happens if the baron decides he doesn't want to pay me back? He doesn't pay me back. Means I'm not going to lend the money next time. So sometimes the rate, because you were going to be attacked, the Jewish community had to come up with a special type of monetary system, so you didn't actually always carry money. You had to carry a marker or faux money that only was good with the Jewish community. So you had to create all these different ways because it was a very dangerous, because you're traveling from place to place and bandits are looking for anybody who's Jewish because they assumed they were money lenders. But that lasted a certain period of time before the Catholic Church changed the laws and Jews weren't doing that anymore. So that's why, but again, most Jews were not in the money lending business. Most were very poor. Some got into finance once the world opened up. Some did very well. Most Jews were very poor in Europe, so as was almost everybody else. Did I answer all the questions? Wow. Okay, right here, I'll do it.
Well, just the significance of the doctor on the ship. Is that the turning point where the Jews are accepted?
No. You have to understand, in Europe at the beginning, let's say in the 1100s, 1200s, Europe was very anti-intellectual. The intellectual world was the Muslim world. In Spain and Portugal, under the control of one of the caliphates. And so Jews were living in this very educated world there, where Jews in Europe were living in a world that wasn't so educated yet. It's going to start changing over time. So Jews are kicked out of Spain, 1492, Portugal, 1496, but some stay. It's illegal to be Jewish, punishable by death. But people stay because they just pretend they're not Jewish. They convert. And a few generations later, people forget that they were originally Jewish. So there were a lot of Jews who were pretending to be Christians. So you can become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, unless you were caught. And this doctor happened to be caught. He was not killed because he was a very prominent doctor for the Grand Inquisitor. That's probably why he was killed. He escaped with the others. So he was a prominent doctor coming from an area that had been pretty educated. But when they moved to England, They were poor, because if you go from one country to another, you may not without any money. But by the reason Jews were kicked out of Spain and Portugal were not because of the Muslims. They were kicked out of Spain and Portugal because the Muslims were kicked out by Catholics. The Catholics kicked out the Muslims. As soon as they kicked out the Muslims, they said, "Get out of here, Jews." And that's what happened. So it wasn't the Muslims who kicked us out. A lot of those Jews went back to the Muslim world. They went back to what is Iran now, or Iraq. Ellen, you had a question?
Along the same lines, I'm a docent. So what happened, I've had school children come. Dr. Nunez was the doctor. And from what I've learned, he may have saved the colony. He came in and there were a bunch of, and he saved it. Many school children have no knowledge of our Dr. Nunez.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not anti-Semitism. We're a very small percentage. This is one thing that happened. If you ask kids, they know Oglethorpe. They won't know anybody else from that period. It's not like they know every other. If you ask them to name one other original colonist, they probably cannot name a single other one except for Oglethorpe.
Okay.
If you're Jewish, you can probably not name a single other colonist except for Oglethorpe unless you come to our museum.
Okay.
So, but I think what we have to talk about the overall impact. What happened in America was a convergence of a lot of different issues and ideas at the same time. It was a perfect storm. You had brilliant people. You were in a continent that is an ocean away from your mother. A lot of us go oceans away to get away from our mothers and fathers, right? You have freedoms here because Britain had become kind of lax and enjoyed the money coming in from this giant continent, never thinking that you would revolt and create a constitution because it had never happened before. I mean, of course, we had the Magna Carta, but it is not the same. The Constitution goes way beyond the Magna Carta. So, the fact that there are Jews living here with Catholics, remember Catholics are fighting with the revolution as well, with Protestants of different sects. I know in the Jewish world we always get along, right? But Protestants don't always get along, right? That was sarcasm for those of you who don't know anything about Jewish history. So this idea of being a citizen of a country as opposed to being a subject. Citizen is a very important word compared to, you're a citizen now instead of a subject. You are an individual instead of being part of a group. Those are the two biggest changes. It's not religion, it's not money. Those are the biggest changes in modern history. And this is what defines us now because we look at ourselves as citizens. We look at ourselves as individuals who are part of a group. And the same thing in Western Europe and a lot of other places, Australia, New Zealand, there are parts of South America, parts of Africa. They look at themselves as individuals, that they're citizens. And we're part of the nation, this idea of nationalism. And this is what brought the Jewish community to such heights in America. And we were just riding the wave. I mean, we were a small part of it, but it was still a major decision. Are we going to do this? Are we going to take the safe route? Because I imagine they thought Britain was going to win. I mean, I imagine if you were a gambler in Vegas, what are the odds? 10 to 1, 100 to 1? I don't know. It's Tyson losing to Buster Douglas, right? It's the America beating the Soviet Union in 1980 at the Olympics in hockey. And so the idea is that I'm going to go with what I think is best, what is right and good, understanding that if we lose, the repercussions are going to be vicious, maybe even dire. And that's what we see from the Jewish community, this idea that we're going to take part of this. And it's not because in 1772 we woke up and said we want to be citizens. Let's do it. That sounds great. No. It's because over 100 years or so, these changes have been going incrementally, and we have been part of it. You know, you move to America, you appreciate it, but then your son, and then your grandson, and your granddaughter, and you start understanding that you're part of this world as opposed to being an outsider. And it's a tribute that people like Francis Salvador, I didn't put a picture, I just pressed. He just moved to America only a few years earlier, becomes a first publicly elected Jewish person. He was named to whatever the Congress, whatever, the Congress, huh? Not kind of, whatever, I forgot what it is. Parochial something, yeah, whatever. He was elected. And of course he died really quickly afterwards, but he'd only been here. So the fact that people coming here had heard about what was going on. He's only been here a couple of years, and he's already dying for this revolution because it's ideas. And this incredible idea resonated with everybody who was willing to take a chance. And it was because I know a lot of you are more knowledgeable about this than me, but when you look at the tax structure, in many cases, the people living in Britain were taxed more than the people in America, even with the increase in taxes. And the representation here was better than in England because you have a say in your community because England is way over there. And yes, you may have a governor, and you have these people, but they may be Tories, but they're not living in Britain. And Tories were kind of almost like second-class citizens and the second-class subjects. So the Jewish community on a whole took this idea and said, we're going to take a chance. This is a unique opportunity. And to have the vision to see that it may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Then, you know, obviously if we had lost, who knows what the world would be like. But at that time, we're thinking, this is it. This is my, I know I have one chance to make a lot of money in business. This is it. I'm going to either make it all or I'm going to go broke. And they took it. Sam.
I'd like to say something about Dr. Nunes.
Please.
Because we asked about his significance. When the people who Overthorpe brought over just a few months earlier were dying, there was some horrible epidemic going on. It wasn't yellow fever. No, it was probably a flu of some kind. But anyway, everybody was dying and was sick. Dr. Nunes comes over with the other Portuguese from England, and Oglethorpe doesn't know whether to let them in or not. So he contacts lawyers in Charleston, and they discover in the charter for Georgia, there's freedom of religion for everybody except Catholics. So they let in Dr. Nunes, and he goes to work, and Oglethorpe credited him with curing this epidemic and saving this colony. So it's a real question as to whether it really did, but they thought he did, and that was good enough.
Now look at this provincial Congress. That's what it was. Parochial Congress, or couldn't remember what it was. I have it right here. Provincial Congress, yeah.
I was going to make a comment. It was a small town about 90 miles west of here, named for Dr. Nunez.
Oh, okay. I didn't even know that.
It's called Nunez, Georgia. It has a population of probably 100 or 200. But it's definitely named for him.
Yeah, another place, and we'll finish up here because Savannah was also unique within the unique nature because Savannah was much more open than most places. In most places there were restrictions, but you also have to remember, if you're Jewish or you're coming from a minority and you see the restrictions placed upon you here, they're almost laughable. You mean, I can't live in this neighborhood? I can't stay in this hotel? I can't do business with this person? Versus they're coming in and killing me and conscripting my kids and I will never see them again. They're ousting me and making me move miles away without anything. I'm not allowed to have food. I mean, it was, again, a very different way of life. So the restrictions, and they weren't, there was a few of them, but most of them were not, you know, they were restrictions by, what's the word, by understanding as opposed to by law.
I know we've hit the end of our time, and I know some of you still have some things you want to talk to the rabbi about, so I'm sure he'll stick around a little bit.
Oh, no,
but
I'm out of here.
but I want to, for those of you who have to slip out, I want to kind of stop here and thank Rabbi Haas for coming out and talking to us. We have a very small thank you for you. Before you do leave, I'd ask you to help us out and fill out our evaluation. If you're not on our email list and you want to be, you can add your email at the bottom. If you're already on our list, you do not have to do that for me. And you can just leave them on the table. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
I learned a lot,
Appreciate it.
and I appreciate it.
Ready?